ancestral and unceded territory of the Hashimen and Sangha peoples. Tonight, we're here to celebrate the First Folio's 400th anniversary with the opening of our newest exhibit, 400 Years of Shakespeare's First Folio, which will be on display in the UCI Library's Langston Library through December 2023. This exhibit examines what makes the First Folio so treasured, incorporating 4 centuries of rare books and artwork. It traces the diverse influences Shakespeare drew from in the late Renaissance, the growing recognition of his genius and his rise in popularity both in England and across the globe, around the globe. The exhibit also pays special attention to UCI Library's copy of the First Folio, which was donated to us by UCI alum Patrick Hanratty in 1986. To start off our evening, you'll enjoy an intimate discussion with our exhibit curator, Derek Quezada, and Eric Rasmussen, one of the world's leading experts on Shakespeare's First Folio. At the end of the program, you'll be invited to view the 400 Years of Shakespeare's First Folio exhibit and enjoy a reception in the Langston Library, where we'll also have the UCI Library's First Folio copy available for viewing. Next, I would like to acknowledge exhibit curator Derek Quezada, who has worked hard on the 400 Years of Shakespeare's First Folio exhibit over this past year. Now the Rare Books Librarian at the University of Southern California, Derek was formerly the Outreach and Public Services Librarian at UCI Libraries. With more than 10 years of experience in special collections, he is intimately familiar with the First Folio copy that's housed in the UCI Library's special collections and archives. And tonight, Derek will be joined by Eric Rasmussen, who is a Regents Teaching Professor and Foundation Professor of English at the University of Nevada. Eric has served on the Board of Trustees of the Shakespeare Association of America and on the Council of the Malone Society. He is also a 3-time winner of the Falstaff Award for Best Shakespearean Book of the Year and co-editor of the Norton Anthology of English Renaissance Drama. Please welcome Derek and Eric to the stage.
All right. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome. So, Eric, we've been talking a lot backstage. I just have a couple of questions for you. Hopefully we have a nice conversation that's kind of a continuation of our discussion back behind the scenes.
With an audience.
We do. We actually have an audience now where we didn't before. I was just telling Eric that we should have been recorded back there because we found some really interesting stories. But, you know, Eric, you're one of the world's leading authorities, if not the leading authority on Shakespeare's First Folio, and you've traveled the world to authenticate newly discovered copies, also to teach and talk about the First Folio. I believe that you just came back on a flight from Istanbul, of all places. So if you could, just tell us a little bit about your work. Where are First Folios still being discovered or rediscovered?
That's such a good, thank you, Derek.
Of course, yeah.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I know there's a Lakers game, so wow. Yeah, I mean, the fascinating thing about First Folios is today we think of it as something that's only could be owned by the ultra-rich, right? But in fact, you know, over the course of 400 years, families acquired First Folios, and it was sort of like the family Bible. But what's really interesting is that these families didn't keep them under glass. And so they had them out on the coffee tables, and they were used. And you can find, there's a copy I found where a cat had walked across with dirty paws. It's a $10 million book. And there are copies with stains from wine glasses, and there are children practicing their ABCs and people doing the household accounts. And I love that these books have been used for 400 years, and we venerate them because they contain the plays of Shakespeare. But also, I love the stories that they have to tell. And then the owners are, oh my goodness, are they wacko? I was
eccentrics,
right?
Yeah.
One of the things I was telling Derek backstage is there's a fellow in Manhattan who owns a 5 or 6-story brownstone, eats nothing but McDonald's morning, noon, and night, owns a First Folio, and the corners of which have been chewed on by rats. And I don't think it happened in he bought it that way, so it's not because of the McDonald's. But he then bought a number of First Folio original pages from a book dealer in London, and then instead of putting the pages in, he cut off the corners from the pages he bought and then pasted them on where the chewed off parts were. And I'm just like, who does this? But the First Folio owners are so wonderfully eccentric and weird, but then there are institutions that have them as well as private individuals, and it's such a pleasure to be able to see. I've gone there. Are about 235 copies around the world now.
And you're a little ambiguous about that number, and I think that's always really interesting. Why no one can kind of pin down a specific number? Maybe you could elaborate.
Because there's some copies we know existed.
Yeah.
There was a copy at the University of Manchester in England that was stolen in, I think, the late 1960s, early 1970s. And we have a good description of this copy, that every corner was stained with a red stain at some point. Now, there's a copy that a private family in Tokyo, outside of Tokyo, owns, and we know there's a public record that they had purchased this, and we approached this family and said, could we look at the folio we're doing a catalog of all known copies, and they said, well, my husband has put in his will that no one can look at the First Folio until 13 years after his death. And it's like, woo,
yeah,
okay. I then came back 13 years later. They wanted nothing to do with me. And we know that this copy that this family owns is stained in red on all the corners. And so we think that it could be the stolen copy from Manchester, but we can't identify it until we see it. And it was pretty funny. An Interpol agent contacted me and said, hey, the dealer who sold them that folio has connections to the Yakuza, and has let it be known that if you were to imply he was trafficking in stolen merchandise, he'll have you killed. Just another day in the life of a boring, tweedy English professor.
I would just never have any idea that it could be so adventurous. It sounds like a lot of what you're doing is sleuthing. I think that's something that I mentioned previously. But yeah, so you're going out and you're authenticating, you're looking at these copies, you're getting threatened. Are there any other places where the First Folio is kind of making odd appearances?
Well, it was interesting. Recently I got an email from a public librarian in France. And he said, I think I may have found a First Folio. And I said, I think you didn't. And because in the 19th century, as soon as photolithography was invented, the first books that they started reproducing using the new technology were First Folios. And they were so pleased by how perfectly they reproduced these books. They didn't put any identifying marks on it to say, this is a facsimile, this is... and these facsimiles are now 200 years old, so they look like old books. And so you can understand if a librarian or a private owner comes upon one of these 19th century facsimiles and says, oh, look, we have a First Folio. But the difference between a folio printed in Shakespeare's time, which was on linen, rag-bound paper with watermarks, with chain lines, is vastly different from the 19th century wood pulp that was used for paper for the. So I agreed at this town to go to this public library in Saint-Omer in the north of France and take a look at their First Folio, and I did a little bit of research on this public library in the north of France. This public library owns a Gutenberg Bible.
Oh my God, so there's a chance.
So, yes, and they inherited their library from a Jesuit college very early on in the 17th century. And so I went over, and sure enough, they had the original watermark pages, and they had a first folio. And this was remarkable. And what I love about that first folio is the Jesuits had a long tradition of theatrical performance, but the young male Jesuit students could not play women. This was a rule. Mm-hmm. And so there is, in their first folio, they have gone through Henry IV, and every time the hostess appears, they have scratched off the last few letters and made her into a host. And at one point, Falstaff says, "Is not my hostess of the tavern a most sweet wench?" And someone has crossed off hostess, making it a host, and crossed off wench and making it fellow. and I just love this, that close to 400 years ago, these young Jesuit students were saying, "Oh, good, there's a play that doesn't have many women in it, and we can make it more," and so that's what I love. But was really funny when the news of that broke a few years ago, the headlines were, "Shakespeare, secret Catholic."
That's really funny. I mean, so you've talked a little bit about this, about identifying the first folios, right? Those features that make it either easy or difficult to authenticate. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what are you looking for when you are authenticating a first folio? And you've touched on a little bit, but maybe some of those stories about fraud, because I know that that's a thing. People are always trying to obfuscate and pull a fast one, so I'm sure that the first folio is no different.
Well, and so basically, when they made paper in the Renaissance, it was a process by which you would take linen rags and you'd pulverize them into a pulp and press them onto a screen through a slurry. And the screen would have sort of wires going down through it, and then the paper maker would weave stitch a little design, a little pattern into the screen. That was his trademark. That was his watermark. So that would leave an impression on the paper. It'd be thinner there. And we still have watermarks. I mean, Microsoft will still let you use watermarks. Yeah. Right? And so that little stitched watermark pattern didn't last very long. So you couldn't make very much paper with that watermark on it. And we found that in the printing, the first folio is a 900-page book. They may have printed maybe 750 copies. We found 21 different watermarks that they used and that are unique pretty much to the first folio. And we found them only in a couple of other books also printed by the same printer as the first folio in 1622, 1623. So if you find one of those watermarks, you know that you've got it.
Yeah.
And I was just there was a copy in Roorkee, India, which we've known about for a century, but no one has been able to authenticate, and everyone's sort of wondered about it. It's a very large book. It'd be the biggest first folio ever. And I just went down there last year, and you can immediately look at a page, and there are no chain lines, there are no watermarks. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you've got a facsimile. And this is at a engineering school, the University of Roorkee, and I tried to spin it to them of, look, guys, you've got the one of the first books ever reproduced. You need photolithography.
It's not quite the same.
I know.
I'm sure that they're pretty disappointed.
I don't think they bought it.
And you said that was in India, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, people are reaching out to you from all over the world. That's really incredible. So, as part of tracking down and examining every known copy of the first folio for the descriptive catalog, which we have right here, and which is literally where I learned everything about our copy of the first folio at UCI Libraries. You've gathered anecdotes of theft and fraud, and again, kind of like poking at that fraud question, I'm wondering if there's any additional anecdotes you'd like to share.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there was a day when somebody walked into the Folger Shakespeare Library wearing, and a friend of mine who was the head librarian there said, he was wearing a T-shirt with a large fish on it. And he came in holding a tattered copy of a First Folio and said, "I'd like to have this authenticated, please. I bought it from one of Fidel Castro's bodyguards." And so they looked at it and they said, "Yeah, this does look like, but we need a few more days to examine it." And he said, "Okay, but please hurry up because I've got to go back to Cuba." And so they looked at it and they called me in because I had done some work with a copy that had been stolen from the University of Durham in the north of England. And this copy had this really weird little wedge-shaped hole that had been cut out in Troilus and Cressida. Nobody knows why, but we had a record of this. And this copy that this person had brought in had this same wedge-shaped hole in Troilus and Cressida. So it's clearly that this is the Durham University copy that was stolen a few years ago. And then it turns out that this guy from Cuba lived 3 miles from Durham in the north of England. And so there was this incredible show trial. This guy, he was such a fantasist. His name was Raymond Scott. He would show up every day in a horse-drawn carriage, dressed all in white, quoting lines from Richard III, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, with a cigar in one hand and a cup of noodles in the other. And it was like, oh my God. And he claimed that he had no assets, but he had 5 Testarossas and drank only, champagne. And we had him dead to rights. And he was sentenced to 6 years in prison, which is the longest prison sentence ever meted out for someone for a rare book theft.
Oh wow!
It was remarkable. But to get back to your forgery question for a minute, if I could, in the 19th century, pre-Xerox, when wealthy collectors had a First Folio that was complete except for a single page, they would contact a noted forger, and this noted forger would make a pen and ink facsimile of them for them very carefully by hand to replicate a folio page. And the British Library got wind of this. And the British Library says, "Okay, dude, you can do this, but you have to sign every one of your reproduced pages." And so when I'll be at a collector's house and looking at their copy of the First Folio, and I say, "Oh, look, you've got one of John Harris's pen and ink facsimiles," which I think is really amazing because this is a 19th century artifact that you are reproducing a printed page using only pen and ink. And wow. And the collectors are almost invariably, "Oh, you mean it's not an authentic page?"
They could see the money going.
Right. So, sorry, but...
Oh, that's great. So 400-year-old texts, like the First Folio, were obviously not mass-produced. And as someone who has personally cataloged all known copies of the Folio, if you could maybe, again, elaborate on some of those details that make the Folio unique. And so kind of what I was wondering about this question was maybe if you could go into the printing history, how these things were actually put together, because I feel like a lot of people have a fuzzy idea, but I think that the actual details are really interesting.
I can, and it is not as boring as it sounds.
Yeah.
I swear to you. So in the Renaissance print shop, one of the most fascinating details is that they thought that if they soaked the ink balls and the paper in urine, that the ink would take better. So they had to produce a lot of urine. So we have records that they drank beer for 14 hours a day. So the people who set Shakespeare's plays into type were all mildly drunk.
It explains a lot.
Yeah, seriously,
It
right?
does.
And what's really interesting is they had proofreading, but it doesn't jive with our sort of 21st century idea of efficiency. So they would set type, and they would start printing pages. And they would print, a page at a time. And when the master of the print shop would come along, and he would pull a proof page, and he'd look over it and maybe make a few changes, hand it to the compositors, the typesetters, and they would say, okay, and they would take the galley of type and they'd make the changes in the type. Well, and then they would start printing again with the corrections. But they've already printed a couple of hundred pages. They didn't care. They would then print 200 pages in the uncorrected state and maybe another 600 in the corrected state. And apparently the idea was, at the top of the pile, you would always have a perfect state. And so if you wanted to give a book to an author to say, look what a good job we did, they would just take the first one of the top of each pile.
With all the mistakes on
Right.
the bottom, yeah.
And with all the mistakes corrected. And then they honestly did not care. So that there are no two copies of the first folio that are alike. Every copy is different because they have various states of press correction. And really fascinatingly, and again, I promise you that this is not dull, in World War II, there was a team in naval intelligence who would examine photos that were taken from U-2 spy planes on successive days. And they would put them on two slide projectors, and they'd strobe the images back and forth. And apparently any troop movements or anything different would show up as movement on the two different photos when you do this. After the war, for reasons no one knows, this entire platoon from naval intelligence went into Shakespearean textual criticism. And Fredson Bowers, one of the great textual critics of all times, was the platoon commander, a guy named Charlton Hinman, went to the Folger Shakespeare Library and decided he would take their strobe effect and start doing this with first folios. And he would put one page up on a screen, and then he'd project the same page from another copy, and he could strobe them back and forth, and if there's any differences between them, any changes, corrections that were made, they would show up. And so by doing this with there are 80 copies in the Folger Shakespeare Library, they were able to show how much of the first folio had been corrected in the course of going through the press. And literally, it took hundreds of years before we were able to say that now. But it is the case that no first folio is the same. They're all different, and not just on what they've experienced in the last 400 years, but what they experienced in the printing house.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's Hinman collator, right? Is that the machine?
That's the machine that Charlton Hinman.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and it's funny because I remember hearing at some point, it could be apocryphal, that UCI's copy of the first folio traveled to Japan and was analyzed under a Hinman collator, and that might have been where they discovered that the first preliminaries were actually facsimiles. I think it might have been the book dealer who was bringing it over to potentially sell, and then through the Hinman collator, they discovered that it was a facsimile and then kind of changed their mind. Because there's this mysterious buyer who changed their mind in your descriptive catalog. And that could have been the case. I think it was coming from the book dealer.
Maybe they found out it didn't have the portrait in the original.
Exactly, yeah.
Deal breaker. I would take one.
Oh my God, yeah. I'm sure if you can find them, you can probably have them. I'm just not sure a lot of people are using them these days.
There's another copy in Japan in the 70s and 80s. Were acquiring every first folio that came on the market. And there's a university outside of Tokyo called Meisei that has a dozen copies. They own William Congreve, the 18th century playwright's copy of Shakespeare. And so I was really interested to see William Congreve, because William Congreve wrote a play that was an adaptation of Antony and Cleopatra. And so I was like, wow, I wonder if he marked it up. This copy has a bullet hole going through it. and the thing is, the first folio is a big book. You know, you'll see if you go to the exhibition tonight. It couldn't just be there on the table and take a bullet. Somebody had to be holding this thing up. And, you know, it's kind of a riff on My Bible Saved My Life.
Yeah.
And then someone has gone through and carefully repaired every page that had the bullet hole going through it.
That is, so did you ever get an answer or hear any sort of explanation for what the scenario
I have
would have
absolutely no idea. I will observe that the bullet stopped at Titus Andronicus, which is clearly an impenetrable play. Right?
That's wonderful. Well, so our exhibit here in Langston Library across the way includes a lot of notable classical influences on Shakespeare and his contemporary influences as well from the Renaissance. So I'm wondering what do you think are some of the most surprising influences or works that Shakespeare likely drew from? I know this is kind of a pivot from the questions about the physical nature of the book and now maybe a little bit more about where Shakespeare was looking for his influences.
Well, it's clear that, you know, in the Renaissance, the Roman comic playwrights, Plautus and Terence, were staples of the curriculum. The way that young men learned to write Latin was to imitate Plautus and Terence. And Terence really was responsible for 5-act plays, a 5-act structure, which Shakespeare clearly, whenever he sat down to write, well, this is how you write a play. Terence was also responsible for love plots that, oh, what if we have a young woman whose father objects to who she wants to marry and she somehow gets around him and goes off and marries her. That's such a Shakespearean love plot, right?
Yeah.
He got that from Terence. Well, Terence was an African slave from Carthage who came to Rome, and his cognomen was Afer, means Africa. There's a really good chance that Terence was a black African slave. And given how often we bandy around, oh, dead white males, the idea that this black enslaved African who died at 25 could have had such a profound effect on world literature and history and Shakespeare, I think is mind-boggling, is just so amazing. And we just kind of think of classical sources. But in fact, when you Terence apparently died at 25 on a shipwreck. He was going to Greece to try to get more stories. Apparently, there wasn't enough material in Rome. And so I really love this when we don't just think of things as, oh, these are Shakespeare's sources, but wow, are these three-dimensional people.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really wanted to attempt with the exhibit that we have over there, is to demonstrate how sort of global Shakespeare is in the way that all of the cultural influences and things that were going on, and a lot of pivotal changes that were taking place in the world, found their way into Shakespeare's works. So I think that that's a fascinating insight. But also, I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about some of his contemporaries that he was drawing from as well, because I know that at least some sort of pastorals from Portugal and other places were also being lifted into some of Shakespeare's plays.
Well, and it is remarkable, as many of you may know, Shakespeare didn't invent a single plot. and the only plays that we don't have plots for are a little bit of The Tempest, and we pretty much think we just haven't found them. I mean, in Shakespeare's time, it was absolutely standard to take an Italian novella and reshape it and make it your own, but in ways that we would think of as plagiarism. And so it's always pretty remarkable when you look at, there is a novella called Romulus and Juliet, Right? This sounds like it's a joke, right? But no, this was Shakespeare's source, where he drew these things from. And what I find interesting, though, is that it's hard to replicate for a 21st century audience something like that in Shakespeare's sources for King Lear. King Lear saves Cordelia from being killed. And King Lear and Gloucester go off and contemplate philosophy and die happily, and Cordelia becomes King of England. I don't think we can imagine what it was like for a Renaissance audience who was all expecting, ooh, this play is going to end happily. And then you get nailed in that way of taking your audience's expectations and nope, and wow. I mean, and then what's interesting, right, is that after 100 years after Shakespeare's time, people started giving happy endings to the plays because they didn't. So Garrick didn't want Juliet to die, so she wakes up, and King Lear doesn't die in Nahum Tate's version, and so there's a whole period of human history where there are happy endings in Shakespeare, and that's pretty fascinating. That this is our wish. This is what we really want. We're always hoping that Romeo and Juliet's going to come out well this time.
And so people just finally took it upon themselves to write that themselves.
Yes.
100, 200 years later. That's interesting. That kind of gets to my next question. And so this exhibit also attempts to demonstrate this like construction of Shakespeare, the genius, right? And you're kind of touching upon that a little bit with this idea of Shakespeare took from other people, but he was aware of people's, and especially audiences' expectations for what was going to happen. So maybe there's almost a little implication in the genius there. He was able to anticipate audience anticipations and change things a little bit. But so I'm wondering, with the construction of Shakespeare, the genius, and we've tried to kind of trace how he's been received over time and his influence, I'm wondering about the importance to drama and literature that you can talk about, how you've seen Shakespeare as this genius emerge and then maybe be pulled apart over time.
Well, and the first folio is really central to this. I mean,
Yeah.
and part of this celebration is of that moment in history. So one has to imagine, before this time, no one had published a folio devoted entirely to plays. Folios were used for theology and history and philosophy and Bibles, right? This was popular culture. This would be like taking scripts for the White Lotus, putting them in a leather binding and calling them works. Now, even those of us who like the White Lotus show would chuckle at that. This is not literature. This is popular entertainment. This is popular culture. That was the case. And a couple of Shakespeare's fellow actors, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, took it upon themselves 7 years after his death to say, hey, these things are really good. Let's go to the trouble and expense, which was a lot. It took 2 years to publish this thing. They had to have a syndicate of publishers involved. It's a hugely expensive book. To go to this length to bring these works out. Now, Ben Jonson, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, had published a folio of his not only plays, but poems and masques, which were more usual to be published in folio. But still, people made fun of him because he called it works. And somebody said, he doesn't know the difference between works and plays. And so the Shakespeare First Folio, 1623, 400 years ago, marks the moment in which we started taking dramatic literature seriously, and which it became something that we would really value and would really think of as significant literary work. And that's an amazing moment in our cultural history because it is clearly the case that Shakespeare was working in what we would consider to be television, and it may have been we tend to think of TV show. We know our favorite TV show. We seldom know who wrote it. we know, we think maybe there was a committee or a writer's room or something, but we don't really think of that. We know the stars, we know the shows, and that's what Shakespeare was. He was way in the background until his fellow actors bring out the first folio and say, this is something worth celebrating, worth remembering, worth preserving. So for me, that moment in time is just profound and has had so many ramifications in culture since then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I think for my last question, I had something lined up, but I actually want to ask you this, which is, out of all of the first folios that you've seen, and you've seen a lot, you've seen everyone that people know about currently, correct?
Yes.
What's your favorite, and why? I know it's a silly question, but I mean...
The UC Irvine copy.
Our copy is lovely. It's, of course, the one I'm most familiar with. But yeah, you've been literally around the world to see. So Japan has, was it 13 copies?
Japan has 13 or 14
Europe,
copies. And
I mean, and then, but California has quite a number of copies as well.
We do very well for ourselves. There are so many nice little things about so many copies. I think there's a copy, I know there's a copy at Glasgow in Scotland where someone there's a page of the actors who had performed in the plays. And next to one of the actors, this early annotator has written, "I know him." Wow! And then next to another, "By report." I've heard about him. And then another, "Eyewitness." Maybe I saw him once, but I don't know him. This was a guy or a woman, we don't know the gender. This is a person who saw Shakespeare's company performing these plays on stage and then was recording in, basically kind of like writing in the playbill. I saw this performance. Next to Shakespeare, they write, "Less for the making." And it's like, what does that mean? Well, maybe you don't see him as much because he's busy backstage writing the plays. So he doesn't act. And this moment of just being with that page and getting transported back 400 years is a remarkable time-traveling experience.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that is just unbelievable as a moment of an encounter with a text that has so much history to reveal to you.
That's amazing. I mean, that feels haunting to be in the presence of a page like that. Absolutely. Well, in the little bit of time that I think that we have left, I might have been flagged. I just wanted to ask you, when was your experience with UCI's first folio? And if you could share a little bit about that experience of coming in and actually looking through and making some of these identifications that I've highlighted in the exhibit, the wine stain, the greasy fingerprints, all of these things that I discovered through your work. I would love to hear a little bit about your experience discovering those.
Well, it's such a lovely volume because it has been used, because it has wine stains, because it's got, people weren't worried about, keeping it pristine. No one was wearing white gloves and it has a scissors that you have spent some time with.
Attempting to analyze,
A mark left by a rusty scissors that, who knows, maybe when the book was being bound, that was left in. I think it's more likely that someone was using it as a bookmark. It's anything you have on hand, and it's in there long enough, and it rusts and leaves. So it has all of these. But what I love most about the Irvine copy is that Hanratty said at one point, he said it to me, I think he said it to the LA Times as well, but this book has started to smell. And it really badly. So I think I need to get rid of it. I could sell it to another collector, but I think I might like to see it again. And I think I'd like other people to be able to see that. And I thought, that is just so lovely, right? I love it that he might want to see it again, but that I could sell it to a collector and then I could make some money, but this way, other people get to see it too. And this is what's so important to me about First Folios, is there are very, very few that are kept in a secret vault somewhere. Virtually every collector is trying to make it available to the world. So, thank you all for coming out tonight, because, we get to go across here and see this. I'm told it doesn't smell anymore.
You will all get a chance to smell for yourselves, hopefully. Well, Eric, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming out, especially after a very long flight, and chatting with all of us tonight. So
thank you, Derek. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Derek and Eric, for that insightful discussion about Shakespeare's First Folios. Now, we had originally planned a performance of UCI's New Swan Shakespeare Center tonight. The New Swan actors traveled to Berkeley last weekend for a performance, and sadly, due to a COVID exposure, they are unable to join us tonight. But we are able to show you a recording of last weekend's performance, and we hope you're able to enjoy the time with them with that video. Please hold on a second while we get the video ready. Oh, one more thing, the scenes are from Shakespeare's Macbeth, which is a special treat, as Macbeth is one of the 18 plays that would have been lost without publication of the First Folio. So this is a special reason why we've selected this play for the performance tonight. Please enjoy.
Well, how many of you know this play pretty well? All right, so I'll do this quickly. Macbeth is a general in the army of King Duncan in Scotland, and he is returning victorious from a bloody battle. There, he meets three weird sisters. Again, these are not called witches in the play. And they greet him with this old title, Thane of Glamis, but also with two new titles he does not yet possess, Thane of Cawdor, and that's one of the rebels he has just vanquished, and King Hereafter, an office far beyond his current expectations. These prophecies will lead Macbeth to do some terrible things. With some prompting, get ready to hiss, by his ambitious wife, Lady Macbeth. Okay, here is the opening of Act 1, Scene 2, on the heath.
Where hast thou been, sister?
Killing swine. Sister, where is thou?
A sailor's wife had chestnuts in her lap, and munched and munched and munched. Give me, quoth I.
Aront the witch, the rump-fed Runyon cries. Her husband's to Aleppo gone,
Master of the tiger. But in a sieve I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do, and I'll do.
I'll give thee a wing.
And I another.
And I myself have all the other. In the very ports they blow, all the quarters that they know. I, the shipman's card, I will drain him dry as sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid. He shall live a man forbid. Weary Sir Knights, 9 times 9 shall he dwindle weak and fine. Though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest-tossed. Look what I have! Show me, show me! Here, I have a pilot's thumb, wrecked as homeward he did come.
A drum, Macbeth doth come.
The weird sisters, hand in hand, posters of the sea and land.
Thus do go about.
Thrice to thine and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9.
Peace, the charm's wound up.
So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Speak, if you can. What are you?
All hail, Macbeth. Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis.
All hail, Macbeth. Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor.
All hail, Macbeth! Thou shalt be king hereafter.
Hail.
Stay, you imperfect speakers. Tell me more. By Sinel's death I know I am Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief than to be Cawdor. Say from whence you owe this strange intelligence, or why upon this blessed heath you stop my way with such prophetic greeting. Speak! I charge you.
In this next scene, Macbeth has killed King Duncan and ordered the death of his best friend Banquo. He returns to the witches once more for guidance, and this is from Act 4, Scene 1.
Thrice the briny path hath viewed, thrice and once the hedge big wide.
Harp your cries! 'Tis time. 'Tis time.
round about the cauldron go. In the poisoned entrails throw. Toad, that under cold stone, days and nights, as 31 sweltered venom sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot. Double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Fillet of a fenny snake, in the cauldron boil and bake. Eye of newt, and toe of frog, wool of bat, and tongue of dog, adder's fork, and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg, and owlet's wing. For a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth, boil and bubble.
Double,
toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble.
Scale of dragon. Tooth of wolf. Witch's mummy. Maw and gulf of the ravened salt sea shark. Roots of hemlock digged in the dark. Liver of a man untrue. Gall of goat and slips of yew, slivered in the moon's eclipse. Now we add the nose and lips. Finger of birth strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab. Make the gruel thick and slab. Add thereto a tiger's chaudron for the ingredients of our cauldron.
Double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good. Well done. Let us commend our pains, and everyone shall join in the games.
And about the cauldron sing, like elves and fairies in a ring.
Chanting all that we put in. By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Open locks, whoever knocks.
How now? You secret evil midnight hags, what is it you do?
A deed without a name.
A deed without a name.
A deed without a name.
We hope you enjoyed the New Swans performance. We're saddened that they couldn't be with us in person tonight. UCI Libraries is so lucky to have such a close relationship with a world-class theatrical company, and we wish them a speedy recovery. I encourage you to learn more about New Swan and attend their delightful summer performances. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Raika Ogawa, and I'm the Assistant University Librarian for Public Services here at UCI. This event would not have been made possible without the support of our UCI Libraries Gateway Society. I would like to invite you all to become members of our Gateway Society, which helps support UCI's world-class research, teaching, and patient care, supports the UCI Library's role as major information resource for our community, and sponsors public programs such as tonight's event. For more information, please see tonight's program. I would also like to thank the library staff, faculty, and students who made today's event possible, with special thanks to UCI Libraries, design services, facilities, and exhibit team members. And now it's time for us to head over to the exhibit at the Langston Library lobby. If you need help finding the Langston Library, you can follow our directional signs outside, which will be marked with balloons. We'll also have a passenger van or cart running to the Langston Library ADA ramp for those who have difficulty with stairs. Due to its limited capacity, we ask that you reserve the cart for those who need it. In the Langston Library, we'll have refreshments, and the UCI Library's copy of the first folio will be available for viewing near the exhibit area. Following the exhibit viewing and reception, we will have passenger vans running back to the Student Center parking structure for all attendees, with 2 pickup locations, one the Langston ADA ramp and the second being the bottom of the stairs near the flagpoles, which you'll pass on your walk over to the Langston Library. Please join me in giving a final round of applause to Derek, Eric, our New Swan actors, Director Eli Simon, and the New Swan Shakespeare Company Center. Thank you all so much for coming.